introduce yourselves.
David, you're up.
Good morning, New Mexico. Welcome, congratulations on your achievement in making it to the National Challenge. It's great to have you here with us. I know you've dealt with a lot of adversity and overcome a great deal in the midst of this virus. So it's nice to be with you this morning. I'm Dave Adler. I'm president of the Alturas Institute, and my colleagues will introduce themselves.
I'm Donald Rogers. I'm adjunct instructor of history at Central Connecticut State University, longtime judge of We the People, and I really admire your making it this far under our circumstances.
Good morning. I'm Dan Taubman. I'm a senior judge on the Colorado Court of Appeals in Denver, Colorado. I'm always glad to see another team that is in the Mountain Time Zone and knows that there actually is a Mountain Time Zone. So I'm pleased, and I share my colleagues' views congratulating you for being able to participate under difficult circumstances. So welcome to the We the People National Challenge.
Will you please introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Ellie Lindsey.
I'm John Waring.
I'm Natalia, and we're all sophomores at Cottonwood Classical from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Mr. Torres is our teacher.
Yeah, good. Nice to meet all of you. Can you tell us a little something about what you were doing before the virus hit?
Well, before the virus hit, we were just going to school, prepping for nationals. We were really excited. I play soccer too, so I was going to go to a tournament in Denver actually, but that got canceled. So now I'm here, so I'm thankful for this.
I tore my ACL, so before this, I was just working on recovering and coming back from my reconstructive surgery.
See, yeah, great.
I was working on ground trying to get a recreational pilot's license, but that's kind of stopped now.
Good. Well, you'll all get back on track shortly. So it'll be my pleasure to read the question to us, to all of you this morning. So we are dealing with Unit 4, and the question here is Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution provides that state legislatures can determine the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives, yet gives Congress the power to make or alter such regulations. What are the advantages and disadvantages of a uniform election process? And then, what responsibilities do state legislatures, state election officials, and citizens have in maintaining free and fair elections? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of the trustee and delegate theories of representation as they apply to congressional districts? Please proceed.
As Alexander Hamilton stated, a share in the sovereignty of the state which is exercised by the citizens at large in voting at elections is one of the most important rights of the subject, and in a republic ought to stand foremost in the estimation of the law. The right to vote is the leash that keeps the governors in the hands of the governed. It is the tool that many people who wish to progress themselves must carry. Seeing as the Constitution allowing voting processes to be regulated both federally and by state governments, the balance between uniform and individualized elections can be seen.
A uniform election process is necessary in only some cases, such as determining who is allowed to vote and protecting that right with the Voting Rights Amendments and federal legislation such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965. With these, you can see that in our nation's history, there has been a need for more federal oversight and more uniform elections. After the 15th Amendment was passed, southern states began doing whatever they could to hold the black vote, such as liberty tests, poll taxes, and the grandfather clauses. This injustice didn't just affect African American communities, but also Native Americans throughout the nation as well. Despite the passing of the Snyder Act in 1904, Native Americans were not allowed to vote in our home state of New Mexico until 1948 after the Trujillo case. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 did, however, receive pushback from some states, with Shelby County v. Holder.
Beyond this, our founders saw the need for states to tailor their voting process to their own needs and to get into the smaller details of voting in hopes of decreasing voter fraud while also maintaining franchisement. They wanted to limit federal power. Thus, the founders decided that federalism and a balance where states were in control of elections and the federal government would only step in to ensure that states were maintaining free and fair elections would be a system that protects both the rights of citizens and the states.
In terms of individual roles in the election process, as citizens, our role relies on our education and familiarizing ourselves with the candidates to cast an informed vote. Election officials are tasked with the organization and evaluation of voting of the voting count, and also noting when certain methods are no longer functioning and attempting to find new methods, funding, or borrowing tools from other jurisdictions. The most important state election officials is the chief election official, who in 24 states, including New Mexico, is labeled as the Secretary of State. Chief election officials generally oversee the finances, scheduling, and establishment procedures of Election Day. In New Mexico, this includes making sure that enough ballots are made in Spanish and Navajo. Finally, state legislatures have to do their part. With the voting process, representatives can pass laws which perfect the smaller details of the voting process in their state. In addition, state legislatures must redraw district lines and do their best to avoid gerrymandering, as seen in cases such as Reynolds v. Sims.
In terms of the nearing presidential election, and as each state participates in their own primary elections, it must be noted that it is key our normal voting practices be modified to decrease the spread of coronavirus, while still maintaining adequate voter turnout. Recently, the New Mexico Supreme Court ruled that they cannot mandate a full mail-in election due to current New Mexico law. This led to the current compromise of mailing statewide elections applications for absentee ballots. In terms of the Uniform Election System, Congress has implemented the Resilient Elections During Quarantine and Natural Disasters Act of 2020. While voting under quarantine can increase our risk to voter fraud and decrease voter turnout, it is still quite crucial that some amount of precaution be taken.
Finally, in order to determine how we want to be represented by our legislative bodies, we must weigh the pros and cons of the trustee and delegate theories. An advantage of the trustee theory is having someone capable of making the hard but right choice. However, by giving this trust, we always have to acknowledge the corruption and self-interest that seems to plague many governments across the globe. By looking at the delegate theory, we have to rely heavily on educated citizens, but the downside of this is a vast amount of differing opinions. Overall, a combination of the two theories would work in our best interest to have someone who listens but can still act quickly in a state of emergency. Thank you. We're now open to questions.
Don, I think your question.
So yes, to what extent does Congress have power to make and alter regulations of the state? I mean, can Congress do anything at once in the long run, whether, in response to the COVID ID crisis or whatever? Are there any limits on what Congress can do?
So Congress has intervened in states and our election processes in the past, as you can see with all the voting amendments, starting with the 15th, that gave Congress kind of the right to intervene in order to help keep citizens able to have their right to vote when they have the right. So our founders wanted state governments to be in control because, as the Constitution says, that power is reserved for the states. And the federal government can only intervene when the state is passing over a line and is starting to take away the rights of citizens and our right to vote. So that's when Congress can intervene. But other than that, it should only be up to the states.
I also think that a check on Congress's power when it comes to intervening with the voting processes of states is the judicial branch and the Supreme Court. And so we mentioned Shelby County v. Holder in our testimony, and that would be one of the main cases where they intervened with Congress and them overstepping their powers.
So has the court been instrumental in defining the scope of power that Congress has. Or does Congress have inherent power under the Elections Clause, Article 1, Section 4?
Congress has the power to step in when it feels it's necessary. I think that most of the ideas that when it is acceptable for Congress to step in is when it's infringing on the voting rights of its citizens, which include that of every state. So when it's when they deem it more of a denial of human rights issues, then that's when they can step in. They don't usually want to mess with time, places, and manner, which is more so up to the state legislature. So that's kind of where they have to separate themselves from voting laws.
Gentlemen, David and Dan?
Dan, please.
You mentioned the Shelby County case. After the Supreme Court decided the case, what did some states throughout the country do with regard to their state election laws?
If I remember correctly, some states started implementing a voter ID process in which people would be it would be mandatory for people to carry a voter ID whenever they voted, and so some people interpreted this as a further way for the state to withhold votes from the Latina and African American community. However, this was one of the steps that states took after Shelby County v. Holder.
And we see another instance of states kind of passing legislation that could affect minorities. Like, for instance, in Montana, they passed an act, it's called the BIPA Act, which limits the amount of ballots an individual can bring to a polling facility. And especially with a high Native American population, this really affected them, as reservations were far from polling places, and they needed someone to come and bring their ballots to the polling places.
You mentioned earlier that Congress is reluctant to step in and alter the decisions made by states with respect to the times, the place, the manner of elections. I want to ask you about the authority of Congress to step in if, say, a state decided, for example, to do away with a secret ballot and have a voice vote, or perhaps if the state, for politically motivated reasons, decided it would have only a couple of election sites or polling sites. Would Congress view those kinds of acts by states as ones that would require congressional alteration or regulation, in your opinion?
So it seems like Congress would it seems like they've been staying away from those sorts of issues. They've been shying away from that kind of thing, but there are a few instances where they see that as limiting too much of the restricting people's ability to vote, which really infringes on election turnout, and it overall decreases the widespread of the election and people's ability to have a voice in their election.
That's time.
Well, that went by very quickly. Okay. Well, so we three have some feedback for you. Let's see, Don, would you like to go first, please?
Be pleasure. So I enjoyed your presentation. I liked your very much informed introductory remarks. I think you argued persuasively the framers were trying to strike a balance between the state's primary obligation to regulate elections, congressional authority. The question of how much power Congress has is obviously pretty important. And there I thought you might have been able to pinpoint a little bit more clearly exactly where that power came from. And you cited examples of, voting rights, the Reynolds versus Sims case. That's a court case, so that's sort of judicial intervention. And you mentioned when voter rights are infringed. That has a statutory basis under the Voting Rights Act. So I thought that you could have been a little sharper about exactly where the authority the Congress got, what the authority came from for Congress, and how then the limits were defined. But aside from that, that was just a very very nice presentation.
Dan?
I think you did a nice job. You showed a good understanding of most of the aspects of the question. I liked your opening quotation from Alexander Hamilton. I thought that was good. I'm glad that you mentioned the Shelby County v. Holder case. That's an important case to mention, and that you were talking about how the state's desire to limit the federal power. I would have liked to have heard you say a little bit more about the 15th Amendment. I know you said that it gives power to Congress to enact laws, but you might have mentioned the specific provisions of the 15th Amendment, Clause 2, that allows that. And similarly, other voting amendments like the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote, and the amendment, the 26th Amendment that gave 18-year-olds the right to vote also. I was pleased with the way that you answered the questions. I like the reference to the Montana law. That showed a good understanding that you've done some research on the background. And it was good that you mentioned the voter ID laws after Shelby County. You might have mentioned other restrictions, such as limiting the polling places or limiting the hours of voting that some states enacted as well. But overall, I think you did a very nice job.
Well, I want to echo my colleagues' comments and insights. I agree that you did a very nice job. I enjoyed your presentation and your opening remarks. I thought that you covered a lot of very important ground, and you did it thoroughly. During the course of your answers to questions, I liked the fact that you were able to readily cite Reynolds versus Sims, talk a little bit about Shelby. I also appreciated the fact that you were able to reference Alexander Hamilton pretty easily. And I too appreciated the breadth of your discussion, particularly your reference to the Montana law. This is an area of the Constitution that has not received a lot of attention, at least it doesn't every year in the way other constitutional provisions do. But I think it's an important section because it looms large now as we deal with the coronavirus, and I was happy that you mentioned that. And in answer to my question about the potential for mischief, a state, for example, turning to a voice vote, or perhaps more likely eliminating many polling places, which would make it very difficult for a lot of people to participate. Those would be the kinds of conditions that would lead Congress to step in. I think you're right. Overall, Congress is reluctant. But if Congress did not step in such a case, then inevitably, we would hope the courts would step in so as to preserve individual rights. So I want to thank you for the time that you put in. It's been a lot of work, and your impressive presentation is really a reflection of the fact that you're under the wing of a very capable teacher. So let's give your teacher and all of you a nice round of applause. Congratulations. And